Mafia Boss got a wrong call from the hospital at 4 a.m., still went and found his ex with twins. The mansion slept like a beast in chains. Every shadow long and heavy, the silence so thick it felt like it could choke a man. Adrian Moretti sat alone in his study, a half-empty glass of bourbon forgotten on the desk beside a pile of open files and an untouched pistol gleaming under the faint light of a single lamp. The clock on the wall ticked like a heartbeat, slow and steady, slicing through the quiet with cruel precision. It was 3:59 a.m., and the night outside was ink black, painted with drizzle that clung to the windows like tears. Adrian hadn't slept in 2 nights. Sleep had become a stranger since the meeting with the Russian syndicate went wrong, since the weight of command began to crush him in ways bullets never could. But deeper than business, deeper than betrayal. There was another wound that kept his eyes open, one that had her name carved into it, Elena. 5 years had passed. Yet her laughter still haunted the corridors of his mind, soft and ghostly, reminding him of a life he once dreamed of but never dared to live. The empire he built was supposed to drown her memory, but instead, it only gave it room to echo louder. He rubbed his temples, staring at the amber reflection in his glass, when suddenly the silence broke, the vibration of his phone cutting through the air like a knife. He glanced at it with irritation first. No one called him at this hour unless it was bad news. But the number flashing on the screen wasn't one he recognized. It wasn't from his men, not from his lawyer, not from the underground network that breathed his name with both fear and reverence. It was a hospital number. His brow furrowed. Hospitals didn't call him, they called about people he sent there. Still, something inside him shifted, a strange unease crawling beneath his skin as he picked it up. "Mr. Moretti," a trembling voice came through. Soft, breathless, almost breaking, "Your wife just gave birth. She's in critical condition. Please come immediately." The words hit him like a slap, jarring and absurd. For a moment, his mind went blank, as if the entire world had stopped moving. Wife? He didn't have a wife. Not anymore. The room felt suddenly smaller, the air thinner. He opened his mouth to correct the caller, to snap at them for waking him with someone else's tragedy, but then, like lightning slicing through fog, he caught the nurse's next words, "Elena Rossi." His heart stopped, the sound of that name cut through every layer of armor he'd built around himself. He hadn't heard it spoken in years, not since that night when he told her to walk away, to forget him, to build a life untouched by blood and vengeance. But she had never really left, not in his thoughts, not in his dreams, not in the way he still kept her old letters in the bottom drawer of his desk. For a long second, Adrian just stood there, frozen, the phone pressed to his ear as the nurse's voice faded under the pounding in his chest. "Sir, are you coming?" she asked, desperate now. He didn't answer, couldn't. The world around him blurred. The ticking of the clock grew louder until it was all he could hear. For a clock. For long, merciless beats of time that tore through the walls of the mansion that he looked around his study as if searching for reason. The empire he'd built, the power, the fear, the money, suddenly felt meaningless. All of it, every deal, every gunfight, every betrayal, seemed to lead to this moment. A wrong call, or maybe fate itself playing cruel games with his soul. He slipped the phone into his pocket, grabbed his coat, and reached for the Glock that lay gleaming on the desk. Not because he expected trouble, but because it was habit, his only kind of safety in a world that never forgave softness. As he buttoned his coat, his reflection in the dark window stared back at him, the cold, unreadable eyes of the man people called the Devil of New York. But beneath that hardened stare, he saw something else, fear that he left the study without turning off the light. His footsteps echoing through marble halls lined with portraits of men who'd all died for the same cause, control. Outside, the rain had thickened, falling in hard sheets that blurred the iron gates and the gravel drive. The guards posted outside stiffened when they saw him emerge. "Boss, where to?" one asked, startled by the urgency in his movements. Adrian didn't answer. He just slid into the back seat of his black Maserati, slammed the door shut, and barked. St. Mary's Hospital. Now. The driver hesitated. St. Mary's wasn't in his usual list of business locations, but one look from Adrian silenced any questions. The car roared to life, tires hissing over the wet ground as they sped into the night. The city unfolded before them, empty streets, flickering streetlights, puddles reflecting fragments of neon signs and ghostly skyscrapers. Inside the car, Adrian sat in silence, one hand gripping the edge of the seat, the other tapping restlessly against his knee. His thoughts churned in a violent storm. Could it really be her? He wanted to believe it was a mistake, some twisted coincidence, but his instincts, honed by years of surviving lies and traps, told him otherwise. The way the nurse had said her name, the tremor in her voice, it wasn't random. It was real. His pulse quickened. 5 years ago, he'd watched Elena walk away down a rain-soaked alley. Her eyes red but strong, her heart breaking while she whispered, "I'll never forgive you for saving me this way." He'd let her go because love had no place in his world. Not when every man he trusted could turn into a weapon against him. But now, as the city lights streaked past the windows, he realized that walking away hadn't protected her, it had only left her alone in a world just as cruel. The thought twisted inside him until he felt something raw crawl up his throat, regret, old and burning. The car took a sharp turn onto the main road leading to the hospital district. Adrian's phone buzzed again. The same number flashed across the screen. He hesitated before answering. "Yes," he said, his voice low, rough with something even he didn't recognize. "This is Moretti." The nurse's voice came through, quieter now, strained. "She's losing a lot of blood. Please hurry." And just like that, his heart finally cracked open. No titles, no fear, no empire mattered anymore. There was only the sound of rain, the hum of the engine. And the name that still owned every corner of his soul, Elena. The drive to St. Mary's felt endless. Though the speedometer pushed far beyond the city limits. The rain blurred the windshield into liquid glass, and every flash of passing light streaked across Adrian's face like veins of fire and shadow. He sat forward, elbows on his knees, eyes locked on the night beyond the glass as if trying to see through time itself. Every passing second screamed in his chest. The wrong call had become a summons from the past, dragging him back to a version of himself he'd buried beneath blood and empire. The city outside was still asleep, its skyscrapers rising like tombstones, but inside that car Adrian's world was coming apart. He reached for his cigarette case, hands unsteady, but the lighter refused to catch. It didn't matter. He wasn't sure if he could breathe smoke through the weight sitting on his lungs. The rain thickened, drumming against the roof like a heartbeat out of control. He watched each droplet race down the window, and his mind returned to the one face he'd spent 5 years trying not to remember. Elena, soft-spoken, stubborn, sunlight in human form. The girl who once told him love wasn't a weakness, that a man didn't lose power by feeling. Only by pretending he didn't. He'd laughed at her then. The cruel laugh of a man too deep in darkness to imagine light. Now her name, her voice, her touch, they flooded through him like an old wound reopened. The road ahead twisted and glistened under the downpour, the city sirens wailing somewhere in the distance, faint and fading. The driver's knuckles whitened around the wheel, but he didn't dare speak. He'd seen his boss angry before, seen him cold, but never like this, never human. Adrian's phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't the nurse. It was Marco, his right-hand man. "Boss, the docs," Marco began, but Adrian cut him off sharply. "Handle it yourself." The words were like steel scraping on steel. Marco hesitated. "You sure?" "They said, I said handle it." Adrian barked, voice like a thunderclap in the enclosed space. Then silence. He dropped the phone onto the seat beside him, eyes never leaving the rain-streaked glass. He didn't care about the docs, the deals, or the $1 million shipment that could make or break alliances. Nothing mattered if the call was real. If she was really there. The Maserati tore down the highway, slicing through puddles that splashed high into the air. When they finally reached the hospital district, the city's emptiness began to fade. Ambulances glowed like restless ghosts, and faint lights burned behind rain-soaked glass. Adrian could feel the tension thickening in his chest, pressing down until his fingers went numb. "Stop here," he ordered quietly. The driver pulled up under the covered entryway of St. Mary's, and Adrian pushed open the door before the car even stopped. The wind hit him with cold rain, sharp and bitter. He didn't flinch. The hospital looked old, beige walls, flickering fluorescent lights, the faint smell of antiseptic that clung to the air. He walked through the glass doors, water dripping from his coat, his heavy boots echoing on the tiled floor. The receptionist glanced up, startled by the sight of him, tall, imposing, dark suit soaked to the shoulders, his expression carved from stone. "Can I help you, sir?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Adrian leaned forward, eyes locked on hers. "Elena Rossi. Maternity. Where?" The woman hesitated. "Are you family?" He didn't blink. "I am now." Something in his tone made her look away and quickly type on her keyboard. "Room 207, sir." But he was already walking before she could finish. The hallways stretched endlessly, white and sterile, yet every step he took felt heavier, slower, as if the walls themselves were closing in. Nurses passed him, whispering to each other, their eyes flicking toward the man who didn't belong here. He reached the elevator but didn't wait. He took the stairs, 2 at a time, his breath harsh and uneven. By the time he reached the second floor, the quiet hum of machines and muffled cries of newborns filled the air. He stopped outside room 207. For a moment, he couldn't move. The door stood slightly ajar, a faint light spilling into the corridor. He could hear voices inside, a nurse murmuring something, the rustle of sheets, the soft whimper of infants. His chest tightened painfully. He rested his hand on the doorframe, staring at the number for a heartbeat longer. And then pushed it open. The smell of antiseptic was stronger inside. Mixed with something warmer, milk, maybe? Or the faint sweetness of flowers left on a table nearby. The room was small, quiet, dimly lit by a single lamp over the bed. He saw 2 tiny shapes wrapped in white blankets in a clear crib near the wall. The nurse was adjusting a monitor, her back turned. Adrian stepped inside, water dripping from his sleeves, his presence filling the room like a shadow. The nurse turned, startled. "Sir, you can't be Elena Rossi," he interrupted, voice low but firm. "Where is she?" The nurse hesitated, searching his face, something in his tone silencing her protests. She pointed to the bed. Adrian followed her gaze, and for a long moment, the world stopped moving. There she was. Elena lay motionless, pale against the white sheets, her hair damp and tangled, her skin as fragile as porcelain. And 4 ran into her arm, the steady beeping of a monitor the only sign that she was still tethered to life. Adrian's throat closed up. He'd imagined seeing her again 1,000 times, in dreams, in nightmares, in the quiet hours when regret gnawed at him, but never like this. He moved closer, each step uncertain, as if afraid she'd vanish if he touched her. The nurse quietly slipped out, leaving him alone in the room. He reached the edge of the bed and stood there, staring down at her face, tracing every familiar curve and shadow. She hadn't changed much, still beautiful, still Elena, but there was exhaustion etched deep into her features, a pain that had nothing to do with childbirth alone. He lifted a trembling hand, stopping just before her cheek. He couldn't bring himself to touch her, not yet. His eyes shifted to the crib, where the 2 infants slept peacefully, their tiny chests rising and falling in perfect rhythm. Something inside him cracked open, raw and unguarded. He didn't know what fate had brought him here tonight, or whether it was mercy or punishment. But for the first time in years, Adrian Moretti, the untouchable, the feared, felt utterly powerless. He took a step back, swallowed hard, and let his eyes close for just a second. The sound of the rain against the window faded into the background hum of machines. The world felt suspended, as if holding its breath. He didn't know what waited beyond this room, truth, lies, heartbreak, but right now, none of it mattered. He was here. The call that wasn't meant for him had dragged him to the one place his heart had always belonged. And as he stood there, watching Elena breathe, the ghost of a life he destroyed began to whisper back to him through the rhythm of the monitors. Through the soft cries of newborns, through the storm still raging beyond the glass. For the first time in 5 years, Adrian didn't feel like a king or a criminal. He felt like a man standing on the edge of something he couldn't name, maybe forgiveness, maybe fate, but whatever it was. It began with that call at 4:00 a.m. The air inside the hospital felt heavier than the storm outside, carrying that sharp sterile chill that seeps into the bones. Adrian stood motionless beside the hospital bed, the faint hum of machines the only sound between him and the woman who once carried his heart like something fragile and alive. His coat clung to him, rainwater pooling around his shoes, but he didn't notice. The faint light from the bedside lamp touched Elena's face, pale and still against the white pillow, and something deep inside him twisted, sharp as glass. He hadn't seen her in 5 years. Yet it took only a heartbeat for every buried emotion to return, every laugh, every argument. Every night she waited for him to come home from a world she hated but endured because she loved him. He looked at her the way a starving man looks at water, unsure if he deserved to drink. The air was thick with the smell of disinfectant and damp fabric. His hands trembled as he reached for the metal rail of her bed, his reflection shivering faintly in the glass beside her. Her lashes fluttered once, barely noticeable, and he caught his breath, waiting for her to wake. But she didn't. The nurse's footsteps echoed faintly down the corridor before stopping at the door. She entered quietly, her expression a mixture of confusion and caution. "Mr. Moretti?" she whispered. He turned slowly, eyes dark but steady. "She's stable for now," the nurse continued, "but she lost a lot of blood. You're not listed as her contact." She didn't have anyone. Except, well, her voice softened. She kept saying your name before she passed out. For a moment, Adrian couldn't respond. The words didn't fully reach him. She kept saying your name. That single sentence cracked something he'd built walls around for years. He felt it all rush back. The night he'd walked away, her tears glistening in the dim light of their apartment, her voice trembling as she asked, "So this is love? Leaving me to protect me?" He had turned his back then, too afraid to show her the part of him that killed without hesitation, that bathed his hands in blood and called it survival. He told himself he was doing her a kindness, that walking away was mercy. But now, standing in this sterile room with the woman he once called his heart lying unconscious before him, mercy felt like cruelty wearing a pretty mask. The nurse adjusted the monitor and gave him a sympathetic glance. "She's been through a lot, sir. If you're family, I'll need to verify I'm staying," Adrian interrupted, voice quiet but firm, brooking no argument. The nurse hesitated, recognizing the command in his tone, then nodded and left. The door clicked softly shut behind her, and the room sank into silence again. Adrian turned back toward Elena, his eyes drawn to the 2 small bundles in the clear crib beside her. He hadn't noticed them clearly before, but now, in the dim light, he could see their tiny faces, soft, perfect, peaceful. Twins. A boy and a girl. For a moment, time folded in on itself. His pulse quickened as he stepped closer. One had a small birthmark just below the ear, the other a tiny tuft of dark hair that curled the same way his had as a child. He didn't need anyone to tell him the truth, it was written in their faces. They were his. His blood. His legacy. And yet, he had known nothing. 5 years of running empires, of making men disappear, of living with every luxury imaginable, and he'd missed this. He rested his hand lightly on the edge of the crib, afraid to touch them but unable to look away. They stirred slightly in their sleep, one letting out a soft whimper before nestling closer to the other. His throat tightened. He had faced death without blinking. Stared down enemies who'd begged for mercy, but now, the sight of 2 infants made his chest ache in ways he didn't understand. The past began to uncoil inside him like smoke from a dying flame. He remembered the warmth of Elena's hands on his skin, the smell of her hair after the rain. The night she whispered dreams about a life far from all this, a small house near the coast, no bodyguards, no blood, just peace. He'd promised her then, swore he'd make it happen. But that promise had died the same night his father's enemies found them and put a bullet through the car she was supposed to be in. She'd survived, but the fear in her eyes after that had changed everything. He saw it again now, not in her expression, but in the hollows of her face, the toll of years spent alone, raising children he never knew existed, carrying the weight of secrets that weren't hers to bear. He wanted to ask 1,000 questions, how she managed, why she didn't reach out, if she hated him, but the words stuck in his throat. She looked so fragile, like a glass figurine that might shatter under the wrong breath. Adrian dragged a chair beside the bed and sat down heavily, elbows on his knees, staring at her. "You said you didn't want this life," he murmured under his breath, barely aware of his own voice. "And still, it came for you." His words hung in the air, unanswered. He leaned back, exhaling slowly, eyes never leaving her face. The memories wouldn't stop. He saw her laughing in a yellow sundress, spinning barefoot on a rooftop as music drifted from a nearby radio. He saw her angry, hurling a glass against the wall when he came home smelling of gunpowder and smoke. He saw her crying in the dark, whispering, "You can't save me by leaving." He believed he could build walls strong enough to keep her safe, but in doing so, he'd only trapped himself in a kingdom made of ghosts. He rubbed his palms together, the faint scent of gun oil still clinging to his skin, feeling suddenly ashamed to be here, this man of violence, sitting in a place of life. The twins stirred again, a faint noise breaking his thoughts. He looked over and realized one had opened its tiny hand, fingers curling as if reaching for something unseen. Without thinking, he extended a finger, and the baby's hand closed around it, impossibly small, impossibly strong. The world stopped again. The storm outside could have swallowed the city whole, and he wouldn't have noticed. There was only that moment, a child's grip, fragile but fierce, and the overwhelming surge of something he hadn't felt in years, belonging. Adrian swallowed hard, his jaw tightening as he blinked away the heat behind his eyes. The name Elena Rossi had brought him here, but what held him now wasn't her name, it was the life she'd created while he was too busy surviving death. And though he didn't yet know what tomorrow would bring, for the first time in 5 years, Adrian Moretti didn't feel alone. The storm outside grew quieter, the rain softening into a steady rhythm against the hospital windows, but inside, Adrian's chest felt like a battlefield of old ghosts and unspoken words. The small hand gripping his finger loosened as the baby drifted back into sleep, and for a long time, he couldn't look away. The rise and fall of their tiny chests, the faint sound of their breathing, it all felt too pure, too untouched for a man like him to be near. His pulse steadied, but his mind spun with 1,000 memories, each one a shard of the past cutting deeper than the last. The clock on the wall ticked softly. 5:13 a.m. Every minute since that phone call had stretched into an eternity. He leaned back in the chair, rubbing his face with both hands, his body trembling with exhaustion he didn't want to admit. He had been through countless nights that ended in blood, but none that left him this hollow, this unsure of what came next. He had built an empire on certainty, knowing who to trust, when to strike, when to run, but here, with the woman he'd once loved lying unconscious and the proof of their bond sleeping inches away, he realized he no longer knew anything. He looked at her again, the slow rise and fall of her chest a fragile rhythm that tethered him to the moment. "You shouldn't have had to do this alone," he whispered. His voice cracked, and he pressed his lips together until the tremor passed. The words were useless now, too late to fix anything, but saying them felt like a small act of penance. The door opened quietly. The same nurse from before stepped in, holding a clipboard. Her eyes softened when she saw him still there. "She's lucky," the nurse said softly, checking the monitors. "Most men would have never come." Adrian looked up at her, eyes shadowed, unreadable. "It was a wrong call," he murmured, almost to himself. The nurse paused, confused. "A wrong call?" He gave a faint, humorless smile. Someone meant to call another man, I think. But somehow, it reached me. He didn't know why he said it, maybe because it sounded easier than the truth, that fate itself had dialed his number. The nurse shook her head. If that's true, then it wasn't wrong at all. She noted something on her clipboard and gave him a small, kind smile before leaving him alone again. Her words lingered like smoke. Not wrong at all. He let them echo in the silence, his gaze falling once more on Elena's face. She looked peaceful now, the pain lines softened by the dim light. Her lips were slightly parted, her breathing steady. A strand of hair fell across her cheek, and before he could stop himself, he reached out and gently brushed it aside. The warmth of her skin beneath his fingertips was like a jolt through his veins, a reminder that she was real, that this wasn't another sleepless hallucination born of regret. He hadn't touched her in years, yet his body remembered every curve, every breath, every heartbeat they'd ever shared. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling. The fluorescent lights above flickered, casting thin shadows across the room. The rhythm of the rain mingled with the soft beeping of the monitor, and for a fleeting moment, he could almost believe that the world outside had stopped, that there was no war waiting for him beyond these walls, no empire crumbling in his absence. It was just them. Her. The children he hadn't known he had. His heart ached with a strange mixture of grief and wonder. He thought about the nights she used to wait up for him, curled on their old couch with a blanket and a book she'd never finish because he never came home in time. She used to leave a lamp on by the window, a soft yellow light that he could see from the street whenever he returned too late, drunk on violence and guilt. That light was his compass, though he never told her. It meant she hadn't given up yet. Now, looking at her lying there, he wondered when that light had finally gone out. He rose quietly from the chair and walked to the window. The city was still soaked, the streets below shimmering like rivers of glass. Dawn was beginning to break, a pale, silver line cutting through the horizon. He pressed a hand against the cool glass, his reflection staring back at him. The man in the window didn't look like a mafia boss anymore. His hair was damp, his jaw unshaven, his eyes hollow but awake in a way they hadn't been in years. For a moment, he thought about leaving, walking out before she woke up, before she could open her eyes and see what he had become. But something kept him rooted there, the same force that had pulled him from his mansion in the middle of the night. Love, guilt, destiny, he didn't know which. Maybe all three. He turned back toward her and the twins, and his throat tightened again. He couldn't walk away now, not when he had already lost so much. The door opened again, this time with hurried footsteps. A doctor entered, flipping through a chart. "You're her husband?" he asked without looking up. Adrian hesitated. The word felt foreign in his mouth, heavy and wrong, yet somehow right. "Yes," he said quietly. The doctor nodded, not questioning. "She's stable, but the delivery was complicated. She needs rest and care, especially the next 24 hours. We nearly lost her to hemorrhaging." The words made Adrian's stomach twist. Nearly lost her. He clenched his fists at his sides, nodding once, the motion mechanical. The doctor placed the chart on the table. "If she wakes, keep her calm. No stress." And, he glanced at the twins, "They're healthy. Lucky, considering the circumstances." Then he left, the door closing softly behind him. Adrian stood there for a moment, letting the weight of the doctor's words sink in. Nearly lost her. The phrase repeated in his mind until it became unbearable. He turned toward the bed, his heart heavy. He sat down again, closer this time, elbows resting on his knees. His voice dropped to a whisper. "I told you I'd only hurt you if you stayed. I told you peace wasn't for men like me." His gaze fell to the floor, his jaw tight. "But maybe I was wrong." He looked up again, and something inside him shifted, the hardness that had defined him for years beginning to crack. The memories that had once been his torment now felt like his only anchor. Every fight, every tear, every moment of tenderness between them, they weren't gone. They had led him here, to this quiet room at dawn, to this fragile, undeserved chance to make things right. The sky outside was turning from gray to pale blue. the first light of morning spilling through the window and landing softly on Elena's face. It made her look almost ethereal, like she belonged to a world gentler than his. He reached out again, his hand trembling slightly, and brushed the back of his fingers against hers. Her skin was cool, but there was warmth beneath it, faint, alive. He felt a surge of emotion rise in his throat, choking him. "You once told me peace would find us someday," he whispered. "Maybe this is it, Elena. Maybe this is how it begins." The words barely left his lips before his eyes drifted toward the twins again. Two fragile symbols of everything he'd lost, and everything he might still save. The rain outside had finally stopped, leaving behind only silence and the distant hum of the city waking up. For the first time in years, Adrian Moretti wasn't thinking about the power he could lose or the enemies waiting in the shadows. He was thinking about the woman on the bed, the children sleeping beside her, and the ghost of the life he might still rebuild from the ruins of the past that never died. The morning light seeped through the hospital curtains, painting soft gold across the sterile white walls. Adrian hadn't moved from her side. His elbows rested on his knees, his hands clasped together as if he were praying to something he no longer believed in. The faint sound of the heart monitor was the only thing reminding him that she was still here, still fighting. Then, a weak whisper broke the stillness. "Adrian." Her voice was thin, trembling, like a note from an old violin, fragile, haunting, and full of pain. His head snapped up. For a moment, he thought he'd imagined it. But when he looked into her eyes, hazel, weary, but alive, the world stilled. He felt the air leave his lungs as he pushed himself forward, kneeling beside her bed. He had imagined this moment so many times over the years, though never like this, not with the scent of antiseptic in the air and the shadow of loss hanging between them. Elena. Her name came out like a confession, breaking against the weight of everything he'd held back. His fingers hovered above hers, afraid to touch her as if one wrong move would make her fade again. "Why didn't you tell me?" His voice cracked, raw with disbelief. He wasn't angry, not yet. Beneath the words was something deeper, something softer. Regret. Her lips quivered, her breath uneven. "I tried," she whispered. "But you disappeared. You left me to survive alone." The accusation in her tone wasn't sharp, it was sorrowful, tired, the kind of hurt that had been carried too long. Adrian closed his eyes, a single muscle in his jaw twitching. The words cut deeper than any bullet. "You left me to survive alone." He wanted to tell her that he didn't leave because he stopped loving her. He left because he thought it was the only way to keep her safe from the darkness that followed him. But how could he explain a decision that had destroyed them both? When he opened his eyes again, his gaze drifted toward the two small bundles sleeping quietly beside her. One wrapped in soft blue, the other in pink. They were tiny, impossibly so. And when he leaned closer, his heart stuttered. The little girl had Elena's eyes, wide and bright even in sleep, framed by lashes too long for her face. The boy had his hair, thick, dark, unruly. A mirror of his own past self. His throat tightened until it hurt to breathe. He didn't need to ask, but he did anyway. "They're mine." Elena's lips parted, her answer barely more than a sigh. "I didn't want them to grow up in your world," she murmured. "I thought if I stayed away, they'd have a chance at peace." But her gaze drifted toward the twins, and a tear slid down her cheek. "Fate brought you here tonight." Adrian swallowed hard. The word fate hit him in a way he couldn't describe. He'd never believed in destiny, only power, choices, and consequences. Yet here she was, the woman he'd tried to protect by walking away, lying in front of him again because of a single phone call that wasn't meant for him. He reached for her hand, his fingers trembling as they brushed against hers. Her skin was warm now, faintly alive beneath his touch. "I don't care about the world anymore, Elena," he said softly. "I care about you." Something inside him cracked open then, years of control, of cold calculation, melting away in the face of the woman who had once been his entire reason for breathing. His thumb traced small circles against her knuckles, grounding himself in her presence. "Do you know what it's like?" he whispered, To have everything, money, power, loyalty, and still feel empty? Every night, I thought about calling you. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw your face. He drew in a shaky breath, his voice rough with emotion. But I told myself it was better this way. That you'd hate me less if you thought I'd never loved you. Her eyes filled again, glistening beneath the morning light. I never hated you, Adrian, she said quietly. I hated the world that made you who you are. Those words hit him harder than any truth he'd heard before. He looked at her, really looked, past the exhaustion, past the scars of time, and saw the same woman he had fallen in love with years ago. The same fire behind her pain. The same heart that had once melted the ice in his veins. He felt powerless in front of her, not because of weakness, but because of love, raw, uncontrollable, human love that no empire could protect him from. Elena, he said, her name trembling on his lips. I don't deserve you. Or them. But if you'll let me, I'll stay. She blinked, startled, as if she hadn't expected those words. For years, she had built walls around her heart, trying to forget the man who had both loved and destroyed her. Yet here he was, the same man, now stripped of his arrogance, his defenses gone, his soul bare before her. Her fingers twitched slightly in his grasp, and though her strength was faint, she didn't pull away. You don't know what staying means, she whispered. Your world? It doesn't let go easily. Adrian lowered his gaze. Then I'll make it let go. The conviction in his tone startled even him. For the first time in his life, he wasn't speaking like a man giving orders, he was speaking like someone begging fate for a second chance. A tear slipped down his cheek before he could stop it, landing softly on her hand. I can't lose you again, he said, voice breaking. Not now. Not after seeing them. The room fell silent except for the quiet rhythm of the monitor. The twins stirred slightly, their soft cries breaking the fragile calm. Elena tried to sit up, but Adrian gently pressed a hand to her shoulder. Don't, he said, his voice firm but tender. Rest. He stood, moving toward the babies. His large hands trembled slightly as he reached down, lifting the boy first. The weight was feather-light, but the feeling was crushing, a life that carried his blood, his legacy, yet untouched by the sins he had committed. The baby's tiny fingers wrapped around one of his, gripping with a strength that shouldn't have been possible. Adrian froze, something breaking wide open inside him. Hey, he whispered softly, his voice barely audible. You don't even know me yet, do you? The little boy blinked once, his dark eyes half open, and Adrian felt his chest tighten until he could barely breathe. He looked over at Elena, who was watching him through a haze of tears. For the first time since he'd entered the room, she smiled, a small, tired smile that reached her eyes. He has your stubbornness already, she whispered. Adrian let out a shaky laugh, one that sounded foreign even to him. Then we're in trouble, he murmured. He placed the boy gently back beside his sister, standing motionless as he watched them both. Two tiny pieces of the past and future lying side by side. Two reasons to change everything. His gaze returned to Elena, and in that instant, he made a silent vow, one he didn't dare say aloud yet, but it was written in his eyes, I will protect you. All of you. No matter what it costs. As the sunlight spilled brighter into the room, illuminating the faint bruises beneath Elena's eyes and the innocent glow of the twins' skin. Adrian Moretti, the most feared mafia boss in New York, felt something he hadn't in years. Hope. And with it came fear? Because for the first time, he had something to lose again. The air inside the room felt heavier as the morning grew brighter. Yet to Adrian it was the first dawn that didn't feel like a threat. He remained seated beside her, silent, letting the rhythm of the machines and the soft breaths of the twins anchor him. Every second near her peeled away another layer of the armor he had worn for years, that cold, calculated mask the world called Mafia Boss. Beneath it was a man terrified of losing what little light he had just found again. Elena's eyes fluttered open once more, her voice quiet but steady now. You shouldn't be here, she whispered. If anyone finds out, it could put you, or them, in danger. Adrian's gaze didn't waver. I don't care, he said softly. Let them come. For once in my life, I'll fight for something that isn't power. She stared at him, searching for the truth in his eyes, and for the first time, she didn't see the ruthless man who once left her to protect her. She saw the same boy who used to bring her stolen roses from the garden across the river, grinning with dirt on his hands, pretending they were bought. That memory flickered between them without a word, shared in the silence. He reached for her hand again, and this time, she didn't pull away. Her skin felt warmer, her pulse stronger, the fragile thread of life returning little by little. I dreamed of this, she murmured after a long pause. Not the hospital or the fear. Just you. Coming back. Sitting there like this. Her eyes glistened as she spoke, her voice trembling between relief and disbelief. I hated you so much for leaving. But the more I tried to forget, the more I missed you. Adrian's heart clenched. I never stopped thinking about you, he said, his voice low, almost breaking. Every night I told myself I'd made the right choice, that you were better off far from me. But when I couldn't sleep, I'd still find myself waiting for your call. I knew it would never come, but I kept waiting anyway. His throat burned as he swallowed the ache. He had survived ambushes, betrayals, even death threats from his own men, but this moment, this quiet confession between them, was what truly undid him. Elena turned her head slowly toward the window, where the sunlight was spreading across the floor like liquid gold. You always wanted to control everything, she said softly. Even love. You thought you could choose when to have it, when to lose it. But love doesn't work that way, Adrian. It never did. He knew she was right. He had spent years trying to bury the feeling that made him human, believing that emotions were weaknesses, that compassion got men killed. But as he watched her now, fragile but unbroken, he realized that everything he'd built had been meaningless without her. You said once that peace would find us someday, he murmured, the memory slipping out like a prayer. I think maybe. It just took longer to catch up. She turned her face back toward him, her eyes meeting his. Or maybe, she said faintly, peace was waiting for you to stop running. Those words hung between them, heavy and true. Adrian leaned back slightly, his gaze drifting toward the twins again. The boy had turned in his sleep, his small fist pressed against his sister's arm as if protecting her even in dreams. The sight stirred something deep in him, a mix of pride and sorrow. He had fought so many wars to build his empire, yet here was the only legacy that mattered. 2 tiny lives untouched by his sins. Do they know? He asked quietly. That I'm their father? Elena smiled faintly, exhaustion pulling at her features. They're only a few hours old, Adrian, she said gently. But they'll know. I'll make sure of it. He nodded, eyes lowering. I want to be part of their lives, he said. The words felt strange on his tongue, he wasn't used to asking for permission. Yet with her, everything was different. You will be, she said after a moment, her voice soft but firm. If you mean what you say. But you can't bring your world near them. No lies. No blood. He looked at her for a long time, and then, slowly, he nodded. No blood, he repeated, as if testing the promise out loud. It sounded impossible, yet somehow necessary. He had built his reputation on power, but now he would have to build something new, something clean, something fragile. He didn't know if he could, but for the first time in his life, he wanted to try. He brushed his hand across his face, the exhaustion of the night finally catching up with him. Elena watched him, her expression softening. You look different, she whispered. Older? Tired? He gave a quiet laugh, the sound rough. That's what happens when you trade sleep for survival. You never had to survive alone, she said, almost to herself. You just thought you did. Her words sank deep into him, stirring memories he had buried too long. He remembered the night he left her, the rain, the sirens in the distance, the way she stood in the doorway clutching his jacket and begging him not to go. He remembered saying, I'm poison, Elena. If I stay, you die. He thought he was saving her then, but now, sitting here watching her fight for life, he realized he had only condemned them both to loneliness. He leaned forward, pressing his forehead gently against the edge of her bed. "I was wrong," he said quietly. "I thought leaving was love. But love doesn't walk away." His voice cracked, the words breaking under the weight of years unsaid. Elena reached out weakly, her fingers brushing through his hair, and for the first time in years, he let himself break. No anger, no shame, just release. When he lifted his head again, her eyes were filled with tears. "You came back," she said softly. "That's enough for now." He looked at her, the corners of his mouth trembling into something that almost resembled a smile. "I'm not leaving again," he said. "Not this time." Silence settled between them, warm and fragile. The light through the window grew brighter, catching in her hair, making it shimmer like it used to when they'd sit by the water years ago, back when the world was simple and love wasn't a risk. He reached out and wiped a tear from her cheek, his thumb tracing the faint curve of her smile. For a long time, neither spoke. There were no more explanations left, only the quiet miracle of finding each other again after being lost for so long. The door creaked open slightly. A nurse peeked in, smiling softly at the sight before her, the man who hadn't moved all night still holding the woman's hand, the twins sleeping peacefully beside them. She whispered something about breakfast and checking vitals later, but Adrian barely heard her. His focus stayed on Elena. Every movement she made, every word she spoke, felt like something sacred, something he had no right to but couldn't turn away from. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper only she could hear. "I don't know what tomorrow brings," he said. "But if you'll have me, I'll build something new, for you, for them. Even if it means burning down everything else." Elena looked up at him through her lashes, her lips parting slightly. "You mean that?" "With everything I am." For a moment, time seemed to stop. The city outside woke up, cars moved, lives went on, but inside that quiet hospital room, it was just them. Two souls who had once been broken, finding their way back to each other through the ashes. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of promises, regret, and a love too strong to die, even after all these years. And as the sunlight finally reached her face, bathing her in warmth, Adrian Moretti realized something that shook him to his core. For the first time since he became a king in a world of criminals, he didn't want his empire. He only wanted her. The morning that had begun in peace shattered in an instant. The soft hum of machines turned into a violent chorus of alarms, piercing through the fragile calm that had wrapped around the room. Adrian's head snapped toward the sound. The monitor beside Elena's bed was flashing red. Her heartbeat faltered once, then again, then disappeared beneath a flat, merciless tone. For a second, he froze, his brain refusing to accept what his eyes were seeing. Then everything inside him ignited. "Doctor!" he roared, his voice echoing through the sterile hall. He grabbed her wrist, cold, limp, and the world tilted beneath him. "Someone help! Now!" Nurses burst into the room, followed by a doctor, their voices overlapping, commands flying like bullets. Adrian stumbled back as they surrounded her, pulling wires, injecting clear fluids, pressing pads to her chest. His heart pounded like thunder. He had faced death 100 times before, on streets, in shootouts, in betrayals, but never like this. Never when it wore the face of the only person he had ever truly loved. He pressed himself against the wall, hands trembling, watching as her body jerked under the shock of the defibrillator. "Clear!" someone shouted. Her chest rose violently, then fell, motionless. Another shock. Again. The sound of electricity snapped through the air, followed by the rhythmic push of compressions. The room spun. Adrian's knees gave out, and he sank to the floor. His vision blurring as memories flooded him, Elena's laughter echoing through old rooms. The way she used to tilt her head when she teased him. The look in her eyes the night he said goodbye. "Not again," he whispered, his voice raw. "Not like this, Elena." The twins began crying from the bassinets beside the bed, their tiny wails cutting through the chaos like blades. Nurses tried to quiet them, but the cries only grew louder, as if they could sense what was happening, as if their souls already knew what he was about to lose. Adrian crawled forward, gripping the edge of the bed. "Please," he muttered, his head bowed, his voice shaking with desperation. "You fought too long to leave now." The doctor's commands blurred into background noise. "Adrenaline, now. Pulse check. One more round." But all Adrian could hear was the fading echo of his own heartbeat, pounding in his ears, reminding him that he was still alive when she might not be. He looked at her face, pale and still, her hair spread across the pillow like dark silk. For the first time in years, he prayed. Not for power, not for victory, but for mercy. "God," he whispered, his hands clutching hers, "I know I don't deserve your help. I've spilled blood, I've destroyed lives, I've taken more than I've given. But please, not her. Take everything else, but not her." His tears fell freely, soaking her skin. He didn't even notice the doctor glance at him. Didn't hear the next command, only the moment when the steady tone on the monitor flickered, stuttered, then began to beat again. Once. Twice. Stronger. The sound sliced through the noise. And the chaos in the room suddenly slowed. "We've got a pulse," a nurse shouted. The doctor stepped back, his shoulders sagging in relief. "She's stable. Keep her under observation." Adrian blinked, unable to move. For a moment, he thought it was another cruel trick of fate, that he was hearing things. But then, her chest rose gently, and air filled her lungs again. He let out a strangled breath that turned into a sob. His body gave way, and he collapsed to his knees beside the bed, gripping the sheet as if it were the only thing holding him to this world. The doctor spoke again, calm but firm. "She's weak. She'll need rest. Don't move her for now." But Adrian barely heard him. He buried his face in his hands, trembling. Relief hit him like a tidal wave, heavy and merciless. For once in his life, he didn't feel like a boss, a leader, or a killer. He felt like a man saved from losing the only part of himself that was still human. When the room finally cleared, he stood again, his movements slow and unsteady. The machines hummed softly now, their beeps steady and sure. He leaned over her, brushing a damp strand of hair from her forehead. "You scared me," he murmured, his voice still breaking. "You always did." Her eyelids fluttered faintly, but she didn't wake. The twins' cries had softened, fading into small, hiccuping breaths as the nurse rocked them gently in her arms. Adrian turned toward them, walking like a man who had aged a decade in minutes. He reached out, taking both babies carefully, one in each arm, his large hands cradling their fragile bodies. They were so small, so delicate, yet they felt heavier than the weight of his empire. He sat down slowly beside Elena's bed, his head bowed between the twins, and let the silence wrap around them. He could still hear the echo of the flatline in his head. That terrifying moment when everything had stopped. It lingered like a scar. But now there was a rhythm again, her heartbeat on the monitor, the twins' soft breaths, his own uneven sighs. 3 different lives tied to his, fragile but alive. He looked at the twins again, tracing their tiny faces with his eyes. "You don't know it yet," he whispered, "but your mother's stronger than anyone I've ever known." His throat tightened, his voice breaking again. "And I swear, I'll be the man she thought I couldn't be." He looked down at them, their innocence almost painful to behold. "From now on," he whispered, his words low but full of conviction, "I'll protect all 3 of you, even if it means walking away from everything I built." He didn't know what that promise meant yet, or how much it would cost him. All he knew was that for the first time in his life, the things that mattered most couldn't be bought, threatened, or replaced. They were here, breathing, fragile, irreplaceable. He leaned down and kissed each of their foreheads, his tears falling softly onto their skin. For years, his name had been spoken in fear, whispered in back alleys, written in blood. But tonight, it meant something different. For the first time, Adrian Moretti's hands that had once taken lives, were holding life. And in that quiet hospital room, surrounded by the soft hum of machines and the scent of newborn warmth, he realized the truth: love had always been his weakness. But maybe, just maybe, it was also his salvation that he turned back toward Elena. His heart still unsteady, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm not losing you again," he said. "Not even death gets to take you from me." The night deepened around the hospital, quiet except for the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock and the steady beeping of Elena's heart monitor. Adrian sat by her bedside, motionless, the twins sleeping in his arms like fragile promises he was terrified to break. His eyes were fixed on her face, pale, peaceful, yet hauntingly distant, as though she were caught between two worlds. The dim glow from the lamp above painted her skin in silver, making her look almost unreal, like a ghost still tethered by love. Every rise and fall of her chest felt like a miracle he didn't deserve to witness. His world had been chaos, violence, and greed, yet here, in this small, sterile room, everything that truly mattered fit within his trembling hands. He remembered the last time he had seen her alive before tonight, 5 years ago. Under the rain outside his mansion, when he told her to leave for her own safety. He could still see the heartbreak in her eyes when she whispered, "You think leaving me will save me, Adrian? You're wrong. It'll kill me." He hadn't believed her then. He thought he was doing the right thing, pushing her away to keep her out of his bloody world. But as he sat here now, watching her fight for breath, he realized how deeply she'd meant those words. She hadn't just survived without him, she had suffered. And yet, she'd still given life to their children. His children. The guilt pressed on his chest like a weight he couldn't lift. The door creaked softly, breaking the silence. A nurse entered, checking Elena's vitals. "She's holding steady," she whispered, glancing at the sleeping babies. "They're strong, just like their mother." Adrian nodded, unable to speak. His throat burned with unshed words. When the nurse left, the silence returned, thicker than before. He looked down at the twins, the boy with tiny fists curled tight, the girl with a faint dimple just like Elena's when she dreamed. He brushed a finger over their soft cheeks, feeling their warmth, and something inside him shifted. For years, he had believed love was a liability, that caring made you weak. But tonight, weakness had never felt so sacred. He leaned forward, resting the twins back into their crib, careful not to wake them. Then he turned to Elena again, taking her cold hand into his. Her skin felt fragile, almost paper thin, yet even in her stillness, there was strength, the kind that came from surviving pain most people would never understand. "I walked away to protect you," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "But all I did was destroy both of us." His eyes closed. And his memories played like ghosts, the deals, the killings. The betrayals that piled up until he couldn't remember the last time he'd slept without a gun under his pillow. "Every night, I told myself I'd call you. I'd find you. But every night, I was too much of a coward." His grip tightened. "You were the only thing that made me feel human, Elena. And I threw you away." A faint sound, a shallow breath, a flutter of movement, made him lift his head. Her fingers twitched weakly in his hand. His heart stuttered. He leaned closer. "Elena?" Her lips parted, a small exhale escaping, but her eyes stayed closed. Still, it was something. Hope flared like light through fog. He brushed his thumb across her hand, his voice trembling. "I'm here," he said. "I'm not going anywhere this time." The clock struck 5 a.m., and the first light of dawn began to creep through the blinds. It cast long shadows across the room, spilling gold over the twins' faces. Adrian looked out the window, his reflection merging with theirs. Outside, the city he ruled was waking up, the same city that had made him powerful but hollow. He'd spent years conquering it, bending it to his will, but now, sitting here, he realized he'd never truly owned anything. Not the streets, not the men who feared him, nothing. The only thing that had ever belonged to him was lying in this bed, fighting for her life. He stood slowly, walking to the small sink in the corner, splashing cold water on his face. When he looked up at his reflection, he barely recognized himself. His eyes were red, his jaw tense, streaks of gray visible at his temples. He looked like a man who had spent his life running from love, and lost every time. He walked back to the bed, pulling the chair closer. You know, he said quietly, people used to say I was untouchable. That Adrian Moretti had no weakness. He gave a broken laugh. They were wrong. You were my weakness the day I met you. He paused, his gaze softening. But now I think you might be my only strength. The twins stirred softly, and he turned to them again, his voice gentler now. You too? You have no idea how many people would have killed to be in your place. But I'd kill to keep you safe. He knelt down beside the crib, his hand hovering above them like a silent vow. No one's ever going to hurt you. Not while I breathe. The old Adrian, the one who lived by blood and vengeance, would have meant that as a threat. But tonight, it sounded like a promise born from love. He leaned back in his chair, exhaustion pulling at his body. The adrenaline that had carried him through the chaos was gone, leaving only emptiness and ache. He rested his head beside Elena's arm, his hand still wrapped around hers. Sleep, he whispered, and when you wake up, I'll be here. His eyes closed, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to rest, not as a boss or a killer, but as a man beside the woman he loved. The dawn outside grew brighter, spilling light through the room, brushing over the family that fate had torn apart and somehow brought back together. In that fragile silence, Adrian's world shifted forever. The power, the empire, the blood, none of it mattered anymore. All that mattered was that she was still breathing. And deep down, even in the exhaustion and pain, he felt something he hadn't felt in years, a spark of peace. Faint but real. He didn't know what the future would demand from him, whether his enemies would come for her, whether his world would let him go. But for now, he didn't care. Right now, Elena was alive. The twins were safe. And for the first time since he could remember, Adrian Moretti whispered something he hadn't said in a lifetime: thank you. It wasn't to God or to fate, but to her, for surviving, for fighting, for proving that even a man like him still had a reason to believe in something pure. As the sun finally rose, washing the city in gold, Adrian sat still, watching her breathe, his hand over hers, the twins asleep beside them. The Mafia boss who had spent his life surrounded by death now found himself guarding the most fragile kind of life, and he vowed silently that nothing, not even his own past, would ever take it away again. The sterile white walls of the hospital room had become Adrian's world. The once mighty Mafia boss now spent his days in silence, the hum of machines and the soft breathing of his family the only sounds that mattered. He hadn't left the hospital since that night. His men had tried to reach him, his empire had begun to tremble, but none of it could drag him away from this small, fragile universe contained in one bed and two cribs. He had traded suits for hospital gowns, command for care, and his days of issuing death orders were now replaced by gentle whispers to the two tiny beings who carried his blood. Each morning he woke with stiff muscles from the chair beside Elena's bed, but he didn't care. He had never known exhaustion could feel so peaceful. The twins had his dark hair and her gentle eyes, and every time they looked at him, something inside his chest broke a little more: the walls, the armor, the cruelty he had built to survive his world. The first time he changed a diaper, his hands trembled like he was defusing a bomb. The first time one of them cried, he froze in panic, afraid he'd break them. Yet slowly, awkwardly, he learned. He fed them with bottles, rocked them through endless nights, and hummed lullabies in a voice unrecognizable to himself, soft, uncertain, yet full of love. The staff had stopped treating him like a dangerous man. To the nurses, he was just another father refusing to leave his wife's side. They whispered about his devotion, about the powerful man who slept in a chair and ate from the vending machine just to stay near her. One nurse even told him gently, "You should rest, Mr. Moretti. She's safe now." But rest was something he didn't know how to do anymore, not when every blink felt like a risk of losing her again. So, he stayed awake, watching Elena's chest rise and fall, each breath a small victory against fate. When she stirred in her sleep, he reached for her hand, whispering promises he couldn't take back. "I'm here. I'm not leaving." Those words had become his prayer, repeated in the quiet hours of the night. On the fifth day, as the sun dipped below the skyline, the door creaked open and Marco stepped inside. His loyal right-hand man, sharp suit, eyes lined with exhaustion, looked completely out of place among the machines and soft blankets. "Boss," Marco said, his voice low. "The cartel's asking questions. Word's spreading that you've gone dark. The Colombians think you're dead." Adrian didn't look up at first. He was busy warming a milk bottle, testing it on his wrist like the nurses had shown him. "Let them think that," he muttered. Marco frowned. "You're losing control, Adrian. The men are getting restless." "The streets," Adrian cut him off with a glance, quiet but final. "Then let them take it." The weight in his voice silenced the room. Marco blinked, unsure if he'd heard correctly. The same man who once ruled New York's underworld with an iron fist was now speaking like someone who'd already buried that life. "You mean, walk away? Just like that?" Adrian looked down at the twins, their tiny hands reaching for his finger. "My family comes first," he said simply. Marco's lips parted, but no words came. He'd seen his boss angry, ruthless, merciless, but this was different. This was something deeper, heavier. It was peace, and it terrified him. For a long moment, Marco stood frozen, torn between loyalty and disbelief. Finally, he spoke again, his tone softening. "You've always told me family makes you weak." Adrian's gaze lifted slowly, meeting his. "I was wrong," he said. "Family's the only thing that ever made me human." Marco had no reply. He nodded once, almost respectfully, before stepping back toward the door. "If you need anything? Anything at all, I'm a call away." Adrian nodded without looking, his attention already back on the twins. When the door closed, the room fell silent again, and he exhaled shakily. He hadn't realized until that moment how much weight those words carried. To walk away meant letting go of everything he'd built, the empire, the power, the fear. But for the first time in his life, letting go didn't feel like losing. It felt like being free. Later that night, the hospital corridor was quiet, washed in blue from the emergency lights. Adrian stood by the window, one hand resting on the glass as he looked out at the city lights below. Somewhere out there, his men were moving shipments, making deals, spilling blood in his name. His name, the one that used to strike terror, now felt like a curse he wanted to forget. He thought of his father, the man who taught him that love was weakness and fear was control. "Never let them see your heart," his father once said. But now, as he looked back at the hospital bed where Elena lay sleeping beside the twins, Adrian realized that was the worst advice he'd ever followed. Because a man without a heart wasn't strong, he was already dead. When he returned to her side, Elena's breathing had grown steadier, her color warmer. The doctor said she would soon wake fully, though she'd need weeks to recover. Adrian sat beside her again, watching her eyelashes flicker as if she were dreaming. "You've changed," came a soft, hoarse voice. He froze, eyes snapping up. She was awake. Her gaze met his, fragile, warm, disbelieving. "You've changed," she said again, a faint smile curling her lips. He didn't speak for a moment, too afraid that any sound would break the fragile moment. Then he smiled back, weary but real. "You were the reason I started killing," he said quietly, the confession raw and unfiltered. "Now you're the reason I'll stop." Her smile deepened, though her eyes glistened. She tried to lift her hand, and he quickly took it in his, pressing it to his chest. She could feel his heartbeat, steady, alive, human. For the first time since he was a boy, Adrian felt something pure course through him, not power, not revenge, but redemption. It was fragile, like glass, but it was real. He had lived his whole life building walls of stone and fire around himself, but this woman, this family, had found the last unbroken piece of him. And as he sat there, holding her hand, the once feared mafia boss understood something his enemies never would: power could command loyalty. But love could command the soul. The days bled together like colors on wet canvas, morning melted into night, and time lost its sharp edges. Adrian remained by Elena's side through it all, anchored to her recovery like a shadow that refused to leave. The world outside the hospital kept spinning, deals were made, enemies moved, men whispered of betrayal, but none of it reached him anymore. The empire he had built on blood and fear was crumbling, yet for once, he didn't feel the urge to fix it. He'd built a kingdom of ghosts, and now he was ready to bury it. Every moment with her, every quiet breath from the twins, reminded him of what he had almost lost. The sound of the heart monitor was no longer a reminder of danger, but of life itself, steady, persistent, defiant. And when Elena's eyes opened longer each day, when her strength began to return, Adrian found himself smiling for no reason at all. It was a small, human smile, unpracticed and real. One evening, as the city lights glowed beyond the window, Elena sat up with the twins resting beside her. She looked fragile but radiant, her hair loose around her shoulders, her skin pale yet warm. Adrian was standing near the window, speaking quietly on the phone with Marco. His voice was calm, measured, a tone Marco had never heard before. "It's done," Adrian said. "Sell the clubs. Close the accounts. Whatever's left, donate it to the children's hospital." There was a pause on the other end, disbelief hanging heavy. "Boss," Marco said carefully, "you're sure about this? You walk away now, you'll never come back." Adrian's gaze drifted toward the bed, toward Elena and the twins. "That's the point," he said, and ended the call. He slid the phone into his pocket, his reflection in the window staring back, a man unrecognizable from the monster he used to be. When he turned, Elena was watching him. "You're giving it all up," she said softly. It wasn't a question. He walked to her, his expression unreadable, and sat at the edge of the bed. "I thought power would make me untouchable," he said. "But it only made me empty." His voice trembled slightly, a crack of emotion breaking through the calm facade. "I used to think love was a weakness, that it made a man lose control. But I was wrong, Elena. Love's the only thing that ever gave me control." She reached out, brushing her fingers over his jaw, tracing the faint scars that still marked him. "You're still the man I fell in love with," she whispered. "Just not the man you used to be." He closed his eyes at her touch, leaning into her hand as though it could wash away every sin he'd ever committed. "That man died the day I walked out on you," he murmured. This is what's left." A silence followed, but it was a different kind of silence, not the heavy kind that came with regret, but the tender one that followed forgiveness. The twins stirred between them, tiny sounds filling the air. Elena smiled faintly and lifted her daughter, cradling her close. Adrian reached for the boy, his large hands gentle, almost reverent. "He looks like you," Elena said. Adrian chuckled quietly. "Then we're in trouble." The moment drew a laugh from her, weak but real, a sound he hadn't heard in years, one that made his eyes sting. "You know," she said after a moment, "when I found out I was pregnant, I wanted to hate you. I tried to. But every time I looked at them, I couldn't. They reminded me of the parts of you that were still good." Her words cut through him softly, leaving both warmth and ache behind. He looked down at his son, sleeping peacefully in his arms. "Maybe that's why fate brought me back," he said. "To prove that those parts aren't gone yet." The door opened quietly, and Marco appeared again, this time without the tailored suit or the cold expression. He carried a small paper bag and a hesitant smile. "Thought I'd bring you some real food," he said, placing it on the table. Elena's eyes lit up, surprised. "Marco, right?" He nodded awkwardly. "Yes, ma'am." Adrian smirked. "Didn't think I'd ever hear you say ma'am to anyone." Marco shrugged. "You're changing the rules, boss. Guess I have to follow." The air softened with quiet laughter, something neither man thought possible in a place like this. Marco glanced at the twins and then at Adrian. "They're beautiful," he said. "You sure you're ready to give up all that for this?" Adrian didn't even hesitate. "I'm not giving up anything," he said. "I'm finally earning something worth keeping." Marco nodded slowly. Understanding that his boss wasn't talking about money or power anymore, he was talking about redemption. As night deepened, the hospital fell silent again. Marco left, promising to handle whatever chaos awaited outside. Adrian sat beside the bed, watching Elena feed the twins. The soft light from the lamp turned her hair to gold, her movements tender and patient. It hit him then, this was peace. Not the kind that came from winning wars, but the kind born from surrender. He had spent years killing men to build an empire, but in this small room, holding his son while watching the woman he loved nurse their daughter, he finally understood what it meant to live. He didn't need the throne, the fear, or the loyalty of men who would die for him. He just needed this, a woman who forgave him, 2 children who carried his hope, and a future that didn't require blood to sustain it. When Elena finished, she leaned back against the pillows, exhausted. "You should rest too," she murmured. Adrian shook his head. "I can't. Every time I close my eyes, I see what I almost lost." She looked at him for a long moment, her eyes soft. "You can't live in the past forever," she whispered. "You've already paid for it." He hesitated, then reached out and took her hand. "Maybe," he said quietly, "but I still owe the world one good thing before I walk away." She tilted her head. "And what's that?" His thumb brushed over her knuckles, his gaze fixed on the twins. "To make sure they never become what I was." Outside, the first light of dawn began to creep through the blinds, painting the room in pale gold. Adrian stood, wrapping his coat around Elena's shoulders. "Rest," he whispered, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "I'll handle everything else." She watched him walk to the window, his silhouette framed against the light. For the first time in years, she saw not a criminal, not a killer, but a man trying to rebuild himself from the ashes of his sins. And though neither of them said it aloud, they both knew the truth: redemption always came with a price. Adrian Moretti was finally ready to pay it, no matter what it cost. The cold marble floors that once echoed with the sound of polished shoes and whispered orders were now alive with giggles and the soft patter of tiny hands. The Moretti mansion, once a symbol of power, fear, and blood, had transformed into something Adrian never believed he'd have again: a home. Morning sunlight poured through the high windows, painting gold on the walls that had seen too much darkness. In the corner of the grand living room, Elena sat by the window, her easel before her, lost in the colors she brushed onto the canvas. Her hair, longer now, caught the light like strands of honey, and the faint smile on her lips carried a peace that made Adrian's chest ache with quiet gratitude. He stood at the doorway for a long time, coffee in one hand, simply watching. The twins were crawling on the floor, Matteo chasing Sofia with a laugh that could melt even a killer's heart. Adrian, the man who had once ruled the underworld with an iron fist, now found himself kneeling on the rug, pretending to lose a wrestling match against 2 toddlers who barely knew how to walk. They climbed onto him, squealing, tugging at his shirt and hair. Their innocent hands pulling him back into a world he thought he'd lost forever. Every day since Elena's recovery had been a new kind of battle, not one fought with bullets or vengeance, but with tenderness. He was learning to be patient, to cook breakfast badly, to stay up through the night when the twins cried. The same hands that once pulled triggers now tied shoelaces, held bottles, and wiped away tears. And in those quiet, ordinary moments, Adrian realized that power had never been control, it was surrender. Surrendering to love, to responsibility, to something bigger than his empire. He brought Elena her coffee and sat beside her, still in his tailored suit, the morning sun warming his face. She looked at him with that knowing smile, the one that used to undo him years ago. "You still dress like a boss," she teased softly, dabbing her brush into blue paint. He chuckled, leaning back. "Old habits die hard." His voice carried none of the hardness it once did. Instead, there was warmth, a steadiness that came from being exactly where he was meant to be. The world outside still whispered his name, the legend of Adrian Moretti, the man no one dared to cross. But in here, within these walls, he was just Daddy. Sometimes, in the quiet hours after the twins were asleep, he would walk through the halls, remembering what they used to mean: the meetings, the violence, the fear. Now the scent of baby powder replaced cigar smoke, and the only command given was bedtime. The staff, once trained to kill or protect, had softened too. The guards outside smiled when they saw the twins crawling toward the door, and the mansion itself seemed to exhale after years of tension. For Adrian, redemption wasn't about forgiveness from others. It was about earning it in the small things: the bottle he warmed for his son at midnight, the lullaby he sang off-key, the way Elena's laughter now echoed where screams once did. One evening, as he tucked the twins into their cribs, Elena came up behind him and wrapped her arms around his waist. He turned, his eyes reflecting the soft light from the night lamp. She whispered, "Do you ever regret it?" For a moment, silence filled the room. He thought of the lives he had taken, the empire he'd built on blood, the years he had lost. Then he looked at her, the woman who had survived his absence, carried his children, and still found the strength to love him. His hand cupped her cheek gently. "Only that I didn't come back sooner," he murmured, his voice raw. Tears glimmered in Elena's eyes, not of sadness but of healing. She rested her head against his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of a heart that had once known nothing but rage. Outside, the city was waking up, traffic beginning to hum, life stirring, but inside the Moretti mansion, time seemed to pause. The world might still fear his name, but here, in this room, he was no longer a king of crime. He was just a man, stripped of armor, reborn through love. And as dawn broke, spilling light through the curtains, Adrian finally understood: peace wasn't something you found in power. It was something you created when you chose to live for someone else. Weeks turned into months. And the rhythm of the Moretti mansion changed completely: no more late-night phone calls. No secret meetings, no blood-stained deals whispered behind locked doors. The walls that once absorbed the cries of betrayal now carried laughter and lullabies. The empire he once built had been dismantled piece by piece, sold quietly under different names. Adrian didn't look back. He didn't need to. What remained was his family, the only empire that truly mattered. Every morning began with the same scene that healed him: Elena sitting in the garden with a cup of tea, the twins chasing butterflies on the grass, their laughter blending with the soft hum of the city beyond the gates. He often stood by the French doors, coffee in hand, simply watching. Watching her brush the stray curls from Sophia's hair. Watching Matteo stumble, fall, and get up again with that stubborn grin, the same grin Adrian wore when life tried to break him. It was in these quiet details that he found redemption. The sound of a child's laughter was louder than any gunfire he had ever heard. And for once, he didn't need chaos to feel alive. Sometimes, when the world outside whispered about the fall of the Moretti name, Adrian would smile to himself. Let them talk. The man they feared was gone. In his place was a father who read bedtime stories and a husband who kissed paint-stained hands. Every scar on his body told a story of the life he had fought to escape, but Elena's love turned each scar into a reminder of what he'd survived for. One evening, rain began to fall, drumming softly against the windows. Elena was putting the twins to bed, humming an old lullaby she used to sing when they were in the hospital. Adrian leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, watching her. The glow from the lamp wrapped around her like a halo, and for a moment, he thought about how easily he could have lost this, all of it, if that wrong phone call had never come. That one mistake by a nurse had rewritten his fate. He would have never known he had a family waiting to be found, never known the sweetness of hearing his children say, "Papa," for the first time. Life had stolen so much from him, but it had given him this miracle in return. After the twins fell asleep, he walked Elena out onto the terrace. The rain had slowed to a mist, the city lights shimmering through the haze like distant stars. She wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders and leaned against him. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked quietly. "The power? The danger?" Adrian exhaled slowly, eyes fixed on the horizon. "I used to think power made me untouchable," he said. "But it only made me hollow. Now, I'm finally full." Elena smiled faintly, resting her head against his chest. "You've changed," she whispered. He looked down at her, his expression soft but certain. "You saved me, Elena. You and the twins, you gave me a reason to be more than what I was." He brushed a strand of hair from her face, kissed her forehead, and held her close. In that embrace, there was no past, no mafia, no ghosts, only the heartbeat of a man who had finally come home. The following morning, the mansion woke to sunlight breaking through the rain clouds. Matteo and Sofia crawled into their parents' bed, their laughter spilling across the room as Elena playfully hid under the sheets. Adrian lay back, watching the chaos with a smile that came from deep within, a smile that belonged not to the feared Don Moretti, but to the man beneath the title. The one who had learned that strength wasn't about control. It was about love that refused to die, no matter how much the world tried to bury it. As the twins climbed onto his chest, giggling, Elena leaned over and kissed him softly. "You're smiling," she said. "That's new." He chuckled, pulling her closer. "That's because, for the first time in my life, I don't have to fight for anything. I already have everything I ever wanted." Outside, the morning light spilled over the city skyline, bright, golden, alive. The Moretti mansion, once a fortress of shadows, now glowed with warmth and new beginnings. The man who once ruled through fear had become something rarer, something purer, a protector, a lover, a father. Adrian Moretti was no longer a name whispered in fear. He was simply a man who found his soul again in the arms of the woman he never stopped loving and the children who carried his future. And as he looked out the window, the twins laughing between them, he whispered softly to himself, "Maybe heaven isn't above us after all. Maybe, it's right here."